Well, the amount of capital they need is the subject of current discussion. As you heard the Secretary testify to yesterday, he threw out the number of $100 billion, and that number is the number that's generally thrown around. I've heard larger numbers as well. There's some people that argue for smaller numbers. To some extent, it depends on what their book of business looks like going forward, and part of the Treasury plan is to open up competition in the private sector for Fannie and Freddie. But $100 billion sounds like a good enough number to play with.
This would be the kind of thing that a company like yours might get involved in, right?
Companies like mine and many other companies, current investors in the structure as well as new investors.
So Fannie and Freddie have been a political football for as long as I can remember. There are people who love them on one side of the aisle. There are people who don't like them, and the government involvement in what is a gnarly area, housing finance. If you look at what the administration proposed last week and testified to yesterday, directionally speaking, taking away the politics of it, is it a good idea to get the government less involved, to end in mortgage finance, to end the conservatorship, and to have it more of a public, a private company?
Yeah,
using the public markets to backstop them.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think most of the folks in the markets think this is a good time, and I give the Trump administration quite a bit of credit for stepping forward with this plan at this time. This obviously has been the third rail of politics over time. Democrats and Republicans have taken both sides of the issue over time, depending on what's convenient for them. And it would be unfortunate if this became overly politicized. I think everyone would concede that the conservatorship was supposed to be temporary in nature. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. That what's happened to the existing stakeholders in Fannie and Freddie is unfair, and it ought to be remedied. And that, as currently constituted, these things are a very large risk to the shareholders. And we're in a time right now where private capital is available and ready to jump in. And the government ought to take advantage of that before we run into a recession or have another housing downturn.
What does that industry look like if there's competition that is brought in at that point? I mean, companies like yours, but the big financial services companies, do they get in as well?
Right. So as Tyler mentioned, I was chairman and CEO of AMBAC, which is a very large guarantor of private obligations and structured securities and mortgages at one time and so on. And so there's a robust world out there of players who are prepared to back these kinds of securities. And, Ginnie Mae is structured in that way. And so what I think the government and Secretary Mnuchin want to do is to get these things to look a little bit more like Ginnie Mae, with a level of private support and then an ultimate government backstop for which the government would get paid, but less government involved.
Very quickly, we would be wrong if we didn't mention a major court decision Friday that basically said that some of the structure of the FHFA and the sluicing of profits over was unconstitutional. Is this an opportunity to make progress?
That's exactly right, Tyler. I'm glad you asked about that because it's a fascinating case. It's a case that also brings into play somewhat the CFPB issues, where the government and the Trump administration have certain views about whether or not that's constitutional. So the government has been on both sides of the issue here, and Secretary and Director Calabria is pretty much very much like the head of the CFPB. And initially, the government, the Trump administration, took the position that it wasn't constitutional, and then they switched positions on that. But the Fifth Circuit ruled that because Calabria is appointed subject to only for-cause removal, that it's unconstitutional. But they also importantly said that the sweep of all of the net worth of Fannie and Freddie, which was implemented after the original act pursuant to a so-called Third Amendment, is also illegal, not in compliance with a bill called HERA, which was the enacting bill for all of this. And they said it's unlawful and it needs to be remedied.